All right, guys, your notes for today, your heading needs to be Chapter 2, Section 5. This is the last section. We will be having a test next, probably Wednesday, over Chapter 2. It is long. It's 5 sections, so you need to make sure that you complete the study guide once it is published so that you can do well on the test. So here's just some objectives for Section 2. It's all about the ratification of the Constitution. So this section is all about the ratification of the Constitution. The last section we discussed the Constitution being created and replacing the Articles of Confederation. And now we're talking about actually ratifying it. So two key terms, some important terms for this section are Federalist and AntiFederalist. I'm not going to have you write those down because they are in the notes later, and you'll get the general definitions of those when we get to that slide. So this is your focus question for today. What issues aroused or started the debate over the ratification of the Constitution? And remember that to ratify really just means to pass. So ratification is to pass the Constitution. Even though the Constitution was written, the states still had to vote on whether or not they were going to accept the Constitution, and that's called ratifying or ratification. So that's the process that we're in now. That's why it's the last section of Chapter 2. So here's some of the answers that you could have written for your focus question. Some of the key issues that were the debate over whether the Constitution should have been ratified or not. So your first heading is a new government. So remember that the rules of the Articles of Confederation were that the Articles of Confederation could only be amended or changed by a unanimous vote of all 13 states. And that was one of the things that they felt made the Articles of Confederation weak. It was going to be hard to get every state to always agree to vote a certain way. But so the delegates at the Constitutional Convention decided that to get the majority of the states to ratify the Constitution would be enough. So the delegates decided to require only 9 of 13 states to ratify the Constitution. So 9 out of the 13 had to agree to pass the Constitution. And that was because they felt that the unanimous vote would be too difficult to achieve. And the rule of the articles being amended, you had to have this up here. You had to have all 13 states. The reasoning behind why they changed it to 9 of the 13 was because the articles were being replaced rather than changed, amended. So that's why they were able to change that rule, because they weren't actually changing the Articles of Confederation. They were replacing it with something new, which was the Constitution. So copies of the new Constitution were sent to the states on September 18th of 1787. Remember, we became independent. We declared independence from England in 1776. Right? So that's 11 years later. The Constitution was written after independence had been declared. So that was, it took 11 years to get that far. Whoops. All right, so your next heading is the Federalists. So that was one of the key terms. You do need to know what a Federalist is for your test. So what is a Federalist? A Federalist is someone who they are supporters of the ratification. they were called Federalists. Okay, so supporters, and really, I didn't mean to erase everything, sorry. You just need your heading, and you need that they were, you can even write that Federalists were supporters of ratification. So you could even write this definition up here beside the word Federalists. What were the Federalists about, right? Well, we know they supported the ratification or the passing of the Constitution. They argued that the Articles of Confederation were weak and needed to be replaced. Remember, you can abbreviate Articles of Confederation. And that was kind of what we talked about in the last couple sections of this chapter, was the Articles of Confederation, they felt they were too weak. That's why the constitutional conventions were held, to figure out how to make a change. So this guy over here, this is Alexander Hamilton. You do need to know that Alexander Hamilton was a leader among the Federalists. So this guy here, Alexander Hamilton, he was a leader among the Federalists. He was one of the biggest supporters of getting rid of the Articles of Confederation and replacing it with the Constitution. So now the opposite, right? The Anti-Federalists. Who are they? That's your new heading, Anti-Federalists. You can do the same thing and just kind of define it. They were the opponents of ratification. Okay, they were called the Anti-Federalists. So this definition, the opponents of ratification, you can just write up here beside the word Anti-Federalists. Remember again, ratification is the passing of the Constitution. They opposed the new ratification process. And this was why. They thought that the new central government, meaning the federal government, would be too strong under the Constitution. They thought that the federal government was too strong and was going to have too much power under this new document called the Constitution. Another important reason that they were against it was because they thought the Constitution needed a Bill of Rights to protect the people. So that was another reason that they were opposed to ratifying the Constitution. All right, so your next heading is the Bill of Rights. So at first, here it says the Federalists felt like the Bill of Rights weren't needed, that a Bill of Rights was not needed in the Constitution. So that's what we're going to write. Federalists said that a Bill of Rights was not needed because. So this is the reason they gave the Federalists, the people who wanted the Constitution passed. This is why they said the Constitution did not need a Bill of Rights. They said it was because the state constitution, so every state had its own constitution, that the state constitutions protected individual rights and freedoms. So we didn't need it in the other constitution because the states already covered that. They also argued that the separation of powers among the three branches of the government would keep the government from abusing its authority. So those were the reasons why they felt that a Bill of Rights was not needed in this new Constitution. But the Anti-Federalists, the people who were against the passing of the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists' opposition was so strong that the Federalists eventually promised to add a Bill of Rights once the Constitution was ratified. So pretty much once the Constitution was passed, the Federalists agreed that they would add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution, but the Constitution had to be ratified or passed first. So at this time, there were lots of writing happening. There was lots of newspapers. People were, printing presses and things like that had just begun. They were in their very early stages. And so Federalist writings is going to be your next heading. The Federalist Papers influenced many Americans to support the Constitution. These are some of the important people who wrote in these Federalist Papers. Again, there's that name, Alexander Hamilton. You don't have to write that down. But, so James Madison, all of these people wrote these Federalist Papers to get the support of the Americans. And most of the Americans read these papers and agreed that the Constitution needed to be passed. So you can see they wrote 85 political essays between 1787 and 1788, and they were published across the entire United States. They were trying to get people in the states on their side that the Constitution needed to be passed. The only thing that I'm going to have you write down here is that these essays, these writings, are still read widely today for their insights into the Constitution. So these essays are still leaned upon in government today, because they did have lots of insight, because these people were, they were in the time, they were living during this time period. So the other side, the Anti-Federalists, they had writings of their own. So your next heading is the Anti-Federalist writings. They also wrote many essays, pamphlets, and letters. The essays by Brutus were most likely written by Robert Yates. We don't know that for sure. But what you need to know is that these writings were first published in New York. We also know this guy, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, wrote a lot of pamphlets against passing the Constitution. So around the country at this time, there was debate over the ratification of the Constitution. And the debate was fed by these various written works expressing strong views on both sides. So that still happens today. We talk about media, newspapers, things like that, that write clearly one way or the other. That was what these papers did then as well. They were clearly, arguing for one side or the other. So people were debating it because they were reading different things. So next, the ratification debate. Ratification, again, means the same thing as like passing, right? So the ratification was swift in some states and bitterly contested in others. So in some states, it passed really quickly, and in other states, it was highly contested, that people did not want it passed. But remember, they needed 9 states. So the Constitution required the ratification of 9 states in order for it to be passed and become the new law of the land. So what you need to know here in this, on June 21st, 1788, you just need to know that New Hampshire became the 9th ratifying state. So New Hampshire was the state that pretty much ratified the Constitution and made it the law of the land. Now, there was some trouble with the ratification. It wasn't just easy. Everybody didn't just agree to pass it. So your next heading, trouble with ratification. So even though 9 states had ratified the Constitution, they did not have the key support. So the Constitution was ratified without the support of the key states of New York and Virginia. The Constitution would fail because these states were so important. So don't worry about writing that one. But here, without the support of the states of New York and Virginia, the Constitution would fail because they were such important states at this time. I'm going to pause here. I'm about to run out of time. Come back for part 2. We don't have much left.